I woke up at 3:15 a.m. gasping for air, as if invisible hands were squeezing my throat. I tried to pray, but the words simply wouldn't come out. My Bible, once so precious, lay dusty on the shelf, while my phone illuminated the dark room. It was at that moment I realized something was preventing me from reaching heaven. 20 years conducting rituals for desperate people. 20 years serving the wrong side of the spiritual war. Even after finding Christ, the enemy attacked me in ways I didn't even notice, until I discovered the power of fasting that would change everything. A truth that cost me half my life to learn, and that today can free you from attacks you don't even know you're suffering. My name is Bakari Mwara. I'm 52 years old, and I come from Timau, Kenya. I spent 2 decades serving darkness before having an encounter with Jesus that completely transformed my life. For years, I was considered one of the most powerful spiritual leaders in the region, performing works for politicians, businessmen, and even celebrities, seeking power, money, and influence at any cost. Before continuing with my testimony, write in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how far my story is reaching. The spiritual battle I'm about to reveal is universal, but manifests differently according to culture. What you'll discover today is a revelation that cost 20 years of my life in darkness and a radical transformation by God's grace. This knowledge will help you identify and break the invisible chains that are blocking your prayers, your prosperity, and your spiritual advancement. If this message touches your heart, consider leaving a super thanks offering so we can continue bringing this liberating truth to more people. When I accepted Jesus, my prayer life was fervent. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. completely alert, thirsting for God's presence. The word was sweet as honey, and I felt heaven so close I could almost touch it. Then, without warning, everything changed. The words dried up. Sleep overcame me precisely at prayer time, and an overwhelming guilt took hold of me because I didn't understand what was happening. What I discovered later shocked me. In my old life as a spiritual leader, I taught exactly this. If you want to bring someone down, first attack their connection with the divine. It's the enemy's #1 strategy. He doesn't start by attacking your marriage, your finances, or your health. He cuts your line of communication with heaven, because if you can no longer pray effectively, all other areas will fall like dominoes. I remember the instructions we gave to newer followers. When you do work against someone, first block the person's prayer life. After that, they'll be vulnerable to any other attack. We performed specific rituals at strategic times, usually between 3 and 4 a.m., what we called the hour of inversion, precisely to create a barrier between the person and their spiritual connection. An elderly lady at church, who barely knew me, approached me after service. "The Lord showed me there's a dense cloud around you preventing your prayers from rising. You need to fast urgently." I laughed internally. Fasting seemed outdated, unnecessary for someone enlightened like me. But something in those words penetrated my pride. What happened after my first 3-day fast would forever change my understanding of spiritual warfare. It was as if a spiritual fog was lifted. On the 3rd day, I woke up at 3 a.m. completely alert, and for the first time in months, the words flowed like a river. I cried for hours in God's presence, feeling the invisible chains breaking. But before I fully reveal this transformation, I need to explain the second sign I identified, one that's affecting millions of Christians today without them realizing it. Have you noticed how your connection with God seems to get interference exactly when you need it most? It's not coincidence. It's a calculated attack. And there's a specific reason why some people seem immune to this spiritual blockage, something I discovered only after years of observation and will reveal soon. When I served darkness, we eagerly awaited the digital era. We knew it would be the most effective method of distracting people from spiritual things without them suspecting, and it worked better than we expected. In secret meetings among spiritual leaders of darkness, we talked about how technology would be our greatest ally. When screens dominate the world, we won't need complex rituals anymore to capture souls, my mentor said. The second sign of spiritual attack is what psychologists call nomophobia, the irrational fear of being without your phone. I realized I was under attack when I noticed a disturbing pattern. My hand automatically reached for my phone before even thanking God for a new day. I went from 2 hours daily in the Word to 5 rushed minutes, while dedicating 4 to 5 hours endlessly scrolling social media. The same symptoms I saw in people addicted to drugs when I conducted spiritual cleansings at the shrine, I began to feel when I was without my phone: anxiety, restlessness, irrational fear, as if an invisible cord bound me to the device. Most frightening, the same brain reward mechanism that entities use to create spiritual dependence is exploited by social media algorithms. It's a digital prison with profound spiritual consequences. In my old life, we performed rituals that lasted hours to create bonds of dependence in people. Today, this same dependence is created in minutes through algorithms that exploit human psychological vulnerabilities. Notifications, infinite feeds, instant validation through likes. All of this creates a reward system that hijacks our attention and, more importantly, our time of connection with God. During a seminar after my liberation, I asked everyone to turn off their phones for just 30 minutes. One woman began trembling and crying uncontrollably. Later, she confessed, "It's the first time in 3 years I've turned off my phone. I felt like part of me was dying." That sent chills down my spine because I immediately recognized it. It was the same behavior we saw in entity disconnection rituals. The enemy is cunning. He no longer needs elaborate rituals to enslave us when we have devices that we voluntarily check 150 times a day. And worse, no one suspects this is a spiritual attack. We think it's just a modern habit. Think about it. When was the last time you spent an entire hour in prayer without interruptions or distractions? Now compare that to how many hours you spend daily on your phone. The awakening to this second sign led me to a radical decision that would completely change my spiritual life. I started a digital fast, 3 days a week. I left my phone off from 8 p.m. to noon the next day. In the first few days, I experienced physical withdrawal symptoms: cold sweats, anxiety, intrusive thoughts about what I might be missing online. It was confirmation of what I suspected. This wasn't just a habit, but a true spiritual prison. But before I tell you how this liberation was completed, let me reveal the third sign I identified during my years of deliverance ministry, a sign that almost everyone experiences, but few recognize as spiritual. Before continuing, I want to speak to you who have tried to fast and felt something was wrong. If you've gone through moments where it seemed your prayers were hitting an invisible wall, know that this is not coincidence. The spiritual world is real, and often we're being attacked without realizing it. There are forces operating against those trying to draw closer to God, and the enemy does everything to make your fast ineffective. That's why I recommend the ebook about the power of fasting and prayer. This material will show you how to strengthen your faith, how to identify spiritual attacks, and most importantly, how to protect yourself against them. It's available for a symbolic price, because what matters most is that you discover the truth. The link is in the first comment. One of the specialties of the shrine I ran was creating blockages and delays in people's lives. We didn't do obvious destructive curses that would raise suspicions. Instead, we created small obstacles: documents that disappeared, meetings cancelled at the last minute, computers breaking at crucial moments, misunderstandings between partners, and so on. The third sign of spiritual attack is constant and inexplicable delays in key areas of your life. I'm not talking about occasional coincidences, but recurring patterns that prevent your advancement precisely when you're about to achieve something important. Have you noticed how certain projects, no matter how hard you try, simply don't progress? How promising opportunities disappear at the last moment. How doors that seemed wide open suddenly close without explanation. The Bible reveals this principle in Daniel's story. For 21 days, he fasted while his answer was blocked in the heavenly realms by the prince of Persia. The angel bringing his answer was prevented by hostile spiritual forces. What many call bad luck or rough patch is often a manifestation of deliberate spiritual blockages. Once, a client came to our shrine wanting to delay a co-worker's promotion. The ritual we performed didn't aim to directly harm the person. That would be too obvious and easily identifiable as a spiritual attack. Instead, we created small obstacles, important documents mysteriously disappearing, communication problems between her and her superiors, small delays that, accumulated, prevented her professional advancement. The strategy worked for almost 2 years, until the victim, a fervent Christian, entered a period of fasting and prayer. Suddenly, all blockages were removed, and she received not only the promotion, but an even higher position. Zimba, a businessman in our church, faced 3 consecutive years of his most important contracts being cancelled, always in the same month, due to inexplicable coincidences. After we identified the pattern, he did a 3-day fast. On the last day of the fast, he received 3 business proposals that had been delayed for months. We later discovered that a former partner, driven by envy, had consulted a spiritual center to block his business. In my experience as a former priest of African Brazilian religions, these delays were our preferred method because they were subtle enough not to raise spiritual suspicions, but effective enough to discourage and divert people from divine purpose. We created what we called blocked paths, situations where the person tried their hardest but seemed to be running on a treadmill. Lots of movement, no real progress. There's a spiritual tool that breaks these blockages with frightening effectiveness: fasting, combined with directed prayer. My old spiritual mentor in darkness used to say, "We can't do anything against someone in genuine fasting. The barriers become impenetrable." He confessed they avoided doing works against people known to practice fasting regularly because the rituals would turn against those who performed them. The power of fasting to break spiritual delays is something I discovered not only in biblical theory, but in ministerial practice. Families who had been financially stagnant for years, despite working hard, experienced significant breakthroughs after dedicated periods of fasting. Couples trying to conceive without success, even after medical treatments, conceived after specific fasts that broke spiritual blockages. The 4th sign I discovered left me in shock because I realized how much time I spent being deceived even after my conversion, and how thousands of Christians continue to fall into the same trap every day without realizing they're under spiritual attack. Before knowing Christ, I was sought out by desperate people, politicians, businessmen, celebrities, all seeking immediate spiritual solutions. What I didn't tell them is that the entities never truly solved problems. They just transferred the crisis from one area to another, creating the illusion of solution. A client might experience improvement in business, but would soon face family or health crises. It was a zero-sum game, where the spiritual price always exceeded the temporal benefit. The 4th sign of spiritual attack is a growing and desperate need for divine intervention in crises that seem to multiply. When I converted, I unconsciously brought this mentality into my Christian life. I expected God to magically solve situations without me having to do my part. I treated prayer as a ritual to activate blessings, not as a relationship. And when solutions didn't come as I wanted, I felt as if God had abandoned me. This is a subtle trap, because it seems spiritual. After all, shouldn't we seek God in times of crisis? The problem is in the mentality. Many Christians see God as a magical problem solver instead of a father who wants true transformation. It's what I call transactional Christianity. I give prayers, tithes, services to receive blessings, protection, prosperity. During a devastating financial crisis, I prayed fervently, but doors remained closed. A pastor who didn't know my background approached me after service. God is waiting for you to fast for this specific situation. Some battles are only won this way. That irritated me deeply. I thought, I already pray. I already tithe. I already serve in church. God should bless me automatically. Reluctantly, I began a 7-day fast. On the 3rd day, I had a vivid dream where I clearly saw that my mentality was still contaminated. I was treating God like I treated the entities before, as a spiritual service provider instead of a father who wants relationship and transformation. In the dream, I saw myself negotiating with God like I did in rituals. If I do this, you give me that. Fasting is not a way to manipulate God to get what we want. It is a process of aligning our will with His. During those 7 days, I didn't receive any financial miracle, but something much more valuable: divine wisdom to identify wrong decisions I was repeatedly making. I noticed patterns of self-destructive behavior that sabotaged my financial life. Fasting didn't bring money from heaven, it brought discernment and discipline. Cardine, a businesswoman from our church, was on the verge of bankruptcy. After a 3-day fast, she didn't receive money miraculously, but had an insight about how to completely restructure her business. Today, 3 years later, her company's revenue is 10 times higher, not by magic, but by divine wisdom received during that period of intense seeking. What many Christians don't understand is that some spiritual doors only open through fasting. Not because it's a magic formula, but because fasting breaks the dominion of the physical over the spiritual, clears our spiritual receptors, and allows us to hear God clearly without the interference of the flesh. Jesus himself said that some types of demons only come out with fasting and prayer, indicating that there are levels of spiritual warfare that require specific tools. The difference between using fasting as a manipulative tool and as a legitimate spiritual discipline lies in intention. Fasting to convince God to do our will reproduces the pagan model of sacrifice to appease deities. Fasting to align our heart with God's and remove spiritual blockages that prevent His will in our lives. That is the biblical model. The 5th sign I identified during my years of ministry is perhaps the most obvious, but often the most ignored or misinterpreted by modern Christians. For years serving darkness, one of my specialties was interpreting dreams and using them as entry points for spiritual attacks. What few know is that the spiritual world constantly communicates through dreams, either to warn, in God's case, or to terrorize, in the enemy's case. The 5th sign of spiritual attack is recurring disturbing dreams. I'm not talking about occasional nightmares caused by stress or horror movies, but consistent patterns of distressing dreams that repeat with specific themes. When someone reported dreams with snakes, attacking dogs, drownings, or seeing themselves trapped in mazes with no way out, we, servants of darkness, celebrated. These were clear signs that the attacks were working, that the person was spiritually vulnerable. In the Toreros, we had specific rituals to send disturbing dreams to target people. The objective was twofold. First, to cause sleep disturbances, leaving the person physically exhausted and mentally unstable. Second, to provoke constant fear and anxiety, weakening their spiritual resistance. A person deprived of adequate sleep for weeks becomes vulnerable in all areas of life: professional, relational, spiritual. After my conversion, I continued having disturbing dreams for months. I saw myself back at the Torero conducting rituals. I would wake up in cold sweats at 3 a.m., exactly the time we used for the heaviest works. I thought it was just psychological trauma until I noticed the pattern. These dreams intensified always on the eve of decisive moments in my ministry. Before important sermons, spiritual retreats, or counseling sessions, the nightmares became so intense that I barely slept. An experienced pastor guided me to do a specific 3-day fast focused on breaking these nighttime attacks. On the first night of the fast, I had the worst nightmare of all, a true spiritual battle during sleep, where entities that once served me now tried to drag me back. On the second night, confusing and fragmented dreams, like interference in a transmission. On the third night, for the first time in months, I slept deeply and dreamed I was in an open field, bathed in sunlight. What I discovered, combining my previous knowledge with biblical truth, is that certain types of recurring dreams are not just manifestations of the subconscious, as modern psychology suggests. They are true spiritual photographs of what is happening in the invisible realms. The Bible is full of examples. God communicated with Joseph through dreams, warned the wise men not to return to Herod through a dream, revealed future events to Daniel through nighttime visions. Makena, a young woman from our congregation, suffered from recurring dreams where she was pursued by shadowy figures calling her by name. After 3 days of fasting, we discovered that a former college classmate involved in spiritualist practices had dedicated her name in a ritual out of envy of her academic success. Fasting not only revealed the source of the attack, but created a protective barrier that spirits could no longer cross. The dream patterns that most frequently indicate spiritual attacks include being chased by threatening figures, drowning or suffocation, paralysis during dreams, commonly called sleep paralysis, presence of animals like snakes, scorpions, or aggressive dogs, encounters with deceased people, falling into bottomless abysses, being trapped in places with no way out. When these dreams become recurrent and affect your rest and mental peace, it's time to consider fasting as a tool for deliverance. Fasting weakens the flesh, which is the receptor of these attacks during sleep, and strengthens the spirit, creating a protective barrier during the vulnerable period of sleep. Many people suffer nighttime attacks without ever connecting these events with the need for fasting. They treat with medication what is actually a spiritual manifestation, obtaining temporary relief without true healing. I'm not saying all sleep disturbances have a spiritual origin. Many are indeed physical or psychological. But when conventional treatments repeatedly fail, it's time to consider the spiritual dimension. The sixth and final sign I will share is perhaps the most subtle and dangerous of all, because it disguises itself as part of your personality, making you believe that that's just how I am. When I served darkness, I knew that the most effective way to keep someone spiritually captive was not through fear, but through pleasure. Evil entities rarely present themselves as terrifying figures. On the contrary, they offer immediate satisfaction to the deepest desires of the flesh. The most powerful rituals we performed were not those that caused harm to enemies, but those that provided temporary pleasures to clients at the cost of their spiritual freedom. The sixth sign of spiritual attack is when you notice that your flesh consistently dominates your spirit in daily decisions. Paul wrote that the flesh and spirit are in constant warfare. When your flesh wins this battle repeatedly, something is spiritually wrong. I'm not talking about the normal struggle every Christian faces against temptations. I'm referring to a pattern of consistent defeat, where you seem incapable of resisting certain impulses, even knowing the consequences. After my conversion, I still struggled intensely with old addictions. I could preach about holiness on Sunday and fall into the same sinful patterns on Monday. The guilt was overwhelming. I tried everything: counseling, support groups, promises, vows, firm decisions. Nothing worked permanently. What I didn't realize is that it wasn't just a lack of discipline, it was a targeted spiritual attack. In my years in darkness, we learned to strengthen people's weak points, areas of temptation where they were already naturally vulnerable. For someone with a tendency toward greed, we sent spirits of covetousness and materialism. For those inclined to lust, spirits of sexual perversion. For those prone to anger, spirits of violence and hatred. When the enemy knows your weak points, He applies pressure precisely there, creating a sense of despair and inevitability. This is who I am. I can't change. Until, in secret meetings between high-ranking priests, we discussed how the strategy of enslaving through pleasure was much more effective than through suffering. Suffering makes people seek God, my mentor said. Illicit pleasure makes them forget him. Our goal was to create dependencies so strong in certain areas of the flesh that the person would feel completely powerless to change, accepting it as their nature. My deliverance began with a 7-day fast, focused specifically on the dominion of spirit over flesh. In the first 3 days, temptations intensified to almost unbearable levels. It was as if every trigger for my old behaviors appeared simultaneously. On the 4th day, something broke spiritually. I felt as if invisible chains that had bound me for years were being broken, one by one. Fasting doesn't magically remove temptations, but it restores the correct spiritual balance. Your spirit connected to God's spirit, taking leadership over the desires of the flesh. It's like readjusting a scale that was unbalanced. Physical hunger during fasting teaches your body that it is not in control. Your spirit determines what the body can or cannot do. Faraji, a businessman from our church, secretly struggled with pornography for 15 years. He tried everything: therapy, support groups, blocking software. Nothing worked permanently. After a 21-day fast, he experienced a deliverance that no human technique had provided. It's as if the intensity of desire has been reduced from 100 to 20, he told me. I still feel temptations, but they no longer have power over me. For the first time, I can simply say no without that agonizing struggle. What I discovered through experiences like this is that some spiritual captivities are only broken through genuine fasting. Not because it's a magic technique, but because fasting positions our spirit in a place of authority over our flesh, reordering the balance that the enemy worked to distort. Many people accept constant defeats in certain areas as just my personality, or that's how I am. And they don't realize they are under targeted attack, strengthened by years of yielding to the same impulses. Fasting breaks this cycle, not just by demonstrating that the flesh can be subjugated, but also by strengthening our spiritual authority to resist future attacks. After identifying these 6 signs in my own life, I began an in-depth study of fasting in the Bible. What I discovered surprised me. There are more than 70 references to fasting in Scripture, many directly related to deliverance and spiritual victory. Jesus began his ministry with a 40-day fast. Moses received the law during a fast. Esther saved a nation through fasting. Daniel received revelations about the last days during a period of fasting. These were not coincidences. They were spiritual patterns, revealing a fundamental truth. Certain spiritual dimensions are only accessed through fasting. What impacted me most was realizing that, in my 20 years serving darkness, there was one Christian practice we truly feared: sincere fasting. We could work against casual prayers, against superficial Bible readings, against empty religious rituals. But sincere fasting created an impenetrable spiritual barrier. It was as if the person fasting was enveloped by a shield that our works couldn't penetrate. In meetings between spiritual leaders of darkness, there were specific instructions. Don't accept works against people who practice fasting regularly. They will return against you with multiplied force. And when a client insisted on doing works against someone known for fasting, we charged exorbitant amounts, knowing we would likely fail. Why is fasting so powerful? I discovered 3 fundamental reasons. First, fasting breaks the dominion of flesh over spirit. When you voluntarily deny the body what it desires, food, you strengthen your ability to deny other carnal desires that enslave you. It's an exercise of spiritual authority that has repercussions in all areas of life. As Paul said, I discipline my body and keep it under control. Fasting is the literal expression of this principle. Second, fasting demonstrates spiritual seriousness. It's like telling God, I am so determined about this situation that I would rather go without food than without an answer. Not because God needs to be impressed by our sacrifice, but because this posture of seriousness opens our heart to receive what He already wants to give us. As an old Christian mentor said, fasting doesn't change God, it changes you. Third, fasting tunes your spiritual perception. During periods of fasting, your ability to discern between truth and lies, between divine and demonic, increases dramatically. It's as if a spiritual fog is lifted from your eyes. Ideas that seemed confusing become clear. Decisions that seemed impossible become evident. Discernment that was dull becomes sharp again. It's no coincidence that great biblical revelations, third, fasting tunes your spiritual perception. During periods of fasting, your ability to discern between truth and lies, between divine and demonic, increases dramatically. It's as if a spiritual fog is lifted from your eyes. Ideas that seemed confusing become clear. Decisions that seemed impossible become evident. Discernment that was dulled becomes sharp again. It's no coincidence that great biblical revelations occurred during periods of fasting. The weakened body allows the spirit to strengthen. I remember a particularly difficult case, a family that had suffered inexplicable attacks for 3 generations, mysterious illnesses, sudden financial bankruptcies, traumatic divorces, always following the same pattern, always on the same specific dates of the year. They consulted doctors, therapists, and financial counselors. Nothing resolved permanently. When they came to our church, I suggested something radical, a coordinated 3-day fast with all family members participating simultaneously. At the end of that period, an elderly aunt, moved by something she couldn't explain, confessed something shocking. 60 years earlier, the family patriarch, desperate for prosperity during a severe economic crisis, had made a pact with entities in exchange for temporary prosperity, compromising future generations. The pact had been sealed with blood and literally buried under the family's ancestral home, a house that still belonged to one of the members. The fast brought to light what had been hidden for decades, allowing us to perform specific prayers to break generational curses. 3 months later, the family's situation had changed radically. Illnesses that resisted treatment began responding to medication. Financial opportunities that always seemed to slip away finally materialized. Relationships that were on the verge of collapse were restored. The fast not only revealed the origin of the problem, but broke the power it held over the family. Another impressive case involved a young artist who suffered from creative block whenever she was about to achieve professional recognition. Each time an important opportunity arose, she was struck by an inexplicable inability to produce. After a 7-day fast, she had a vivid dream where she relived a moment from her childhood that she had completely repressed. At age 8, after winning an art contest at school, her father, an alcoholic and abusive man, destroyed her winning painting, saying that people like us don't deserve success. This memory had created a spiritual block that sabotaged her whenever success approached. The fast not only revealed the root of the problem, but released the emotional and spiritual healing needed to overcome it. In my experience ministering to hundreds of people, I've discovered that fasting frequently reveals roots of problems that no other spiritual practice can expose. It's like a spiritual X-ray that penetrates beyond superficial layers, revealing the true origin of the battles we face. For years after my conversion, I treated fasting as an emergency spiritual tool, something to be used only in moments of extreme crisis. When problems were resolved, I returned to my normal routine, completely forgetting about fasting until the next emergency. It was a cycle of defeat, victory, defeat that seemed endless. One revelation completely transformed my understanding and practice. Fasting should not only be reactive, but preventive. This was a paradigm shift for me. Jesus said that certain types of demons only come out through fasting and prayer. What I learned is that certain types are also only kept away through regular fasting. The enemy doesn't wait for you to be prepared to attack. He looks for moments of vulnerability when your spiritual defenses are low. Regular fasting creates a continuous protective barrier, not just a temporary shield in moments of crisis. It's the difference between medicating an already established disease and strengthening the immune system to prevent it. I implemented a pattern of regular fasting in my life, the first day of each month, plus specific periods throughout the year. The difference was extraordinary. Instead of constantly fighting against the same attacks and retreating to fasting when the situation became desperate, I began to experience constant spiritual peace and clarity. Attacks that used to knock me down for weeks now could barely affect me for hours. The most powerful aspect of this practice is that it allows me to identify spiritual attacks in early stages, before they become strongholds. It's like a strengthened spiritual immune system that recognizes and neutralizes threats before they cause significant damage. My spiritual sensitivity became so sharp that I could discern attacks that I would have previously confused with bad days or negative coincidences. I shared this principle with Jana, a young mother who struggled with recurring depression that seemed to attack her cyclically, especially before important opportunities. She implemented a day of fasting every 2 weeks, always on Wednesdays. 6 months later, I received a message from her. For the first time, I felt the depression trying to return, but it was as if there was a barrier it couldn't cross. The darkness stayed outside. I could see the attack, recognize it for what it was, and remain protected. The secret to permanent liberation lies in preventive, regular, and consistent fasting. It's not just about winning specific battles, but about winning the war continuously. It's like the difference between constantly putting out fires and building a fireproof structure. Both have their place, but only the second offers lasting peace. And there's a final aspect rarely discussed: collective fasting. When families, groups, or churches fast together for a specific purpose, the impact is multiplied exponentially. The Bible clearly shows this in the story of Esther, where the collective fasting of the Jews changed the destiny of a nation. I have witnessed transformations of entire communities through this practice. Neighborhoods where violence decreased dramatically, schools where performance improved significantly, companies where conflicts were resolved miraculously. Once, a rural community faced a devastating drought for almost 2 years. Prayers seemed fruitless. We guided a 3-day collective fast where practically all 400 inhabitants participated. On the 3rd day, clouds began to form. On the 4th day, it rained for the first time in 22 months. Coincidence? Perhaps. But I've seen similar patterns repeated too many times to believe in mere coincidence. Another powerful example occurred in a school where bullying and violence had become epidemic. A group of Christian parents and teachers started a rotating fast. Each person fasted 1 day per week, ensuring that each school day was covered by someone fasting. In 3 months, the school's atmosphere had changed so drastically that even non-Christian administrators recognized the transformation without understanding its cause. Collective fasting creates what I call liberation zones, geographical, relational, or institutional areas where the influence of darkness is significantly reduced, allowing God's light to shine more intensely. It's not a magic formula, but a spiritual dynamic based on consistent biblical principles. Brothers and sisters, in sharing these 6 signs of spiritual attack and the transforming power of fasting, my heart burns with urgency. It's no coincidence that you're watching this video today. God has a purpose in connecting your heart with this message at this specific moment. Look honestly at your life. Have you found it difficult to pray? Are you addicted to your phone, prioritizing it above communion with God? Do you face inexplicable delays in key areas? Do you urgently need divine intervention? Do you have recurring disturbing dreams? Do you feel that your flesh constantly dominates your spirit? If you identified one or more of these signs, don't ignore the spiritual alert. The enemy works in the shadows, counting on our ignorance and complacency. But now you know. And knowledge brings responsibility. I invite you to begin a fasting journey, starting with a short period, perhaps 12 hours or one day, and gradually increasing. It's not about deprivation, it's about liberation. It's not about punishment, it's about restoring divine order in your life. For years, I kept this knowledge within the limits of in-person ministry, sharing only with those we could directly accompany. But the Lord has been pressing me to expand the reach, to take these truths to people we may never meet personally, but who are suffering the same silent attacks. This deliverance ministry has revealed to thousands of people how to identify and break the influence of monitoring spirits in their lives. To continue taking this truth to those still suffering invisible attacks, we need your support. If this revelation opened your eyes to spiritual interference you are facing, consider showing your gratitude with an offering through Super Thanks of up to $100,000. Your financial seed will allow others to also find liberation. Remember, the enemy thrives on ignorance. When you recognize his attacks, half the battle is already won. When you implement fasting as a response, victory is assured. I want to end this testimony with a truth I discovered after decades in darkness and now years in the light. The enemy doesn't fear your biblical knowledge, your position in the church, or your spiritual gifts. What he truly fears is a child of God who has discovered the power of fasting and implements it regularly. In secret meetings among priests of darkness, we spoke openly about how to neutralize different types of Christians. Sunday Christians were considered harmless. Christians of theological knowledge were seen as moderate threats. But there was one group that was mentioned with genuine fear: the fasting Christians, those who had discovered and implemented the power of this ancient practice. For these, the guidance was clear: avoid direct confrontation. They have spiritual authority that can cause serious damage to our operations. Fasting is not just an ancient religious practice, it's a timeless spiritual weapon that has never lost its effectiveness. In a world where quick and painless solutions are valued, fasting remains as a path of self-discipline and genuine spiritual power. It's countercultural, uncomfortable, and demanding. Perhaps that's why it's so powerful in an era of instant gratification. Share this video with someone you know who may be under spiritual attack without realizing it. Your decision to share could literally save a life, a marriage, a family. Don't underestimate the power of a word at the right time. The enemy works to keep people in ignorance, believing their problems are purely psychological, financial, or relational, when in fact there's a spiritual dimension that needs to be addressed. If you're convinced you're being victimized by witchcraft, curses, envy, and gossip, follow our prayer channel where we share powerful prayers to break these negative influences. No one needs to remain in captivity when the truth is available. I've seen people completely transformed after correctly identifying the attacks they were suffering and implementing fasting as a response. Remember Jesus' words: "This kind of demon comes out only by prayer and fasting." There are battles you'll never win with knowledge or human effort alone. Some victories only come through the supernatural power released by sincere fasting. One last story before we close. Paulo, a pastor who had completely lost his passion for ministry, was about to abandon the calling. After hearing a message about fasting, he decided to dedicate 7 days to the Lord. On the 5th day, he had a vision of angels removing spiritual blocks that had been strategically placed in his mind. These blocks prevented him from feeling God's presence as before. After the fast, his ministry was not only restored, but elevated to a level of impact he had never experienced. May God open your spiritual eyes to see attacks before they become strongholds. And may the Holy Spirit strengthen you to implement the discipline of fasting as a lifestyle, not just as an emergency resource. The liberation you seek is just one fast away. If this testimony touched your heart, don't just watch and move on. Respond, act, implement. Start a fast today, even if it's just one meal, as a first step toward your complete liberation. The enemy trembled seeing you watch this video to the end. He knows what will happen when you put this knowledge into practice. Don't let fear, procrastination, or skepticism prevent you from experiencing the liberating power of fasting. The choice is now yours. Will you continue suffering silent attacks, or will you rise in spiritual authority to break them definitively? May God bless and strengthen you in your decision.